Let me give one other example. A lot of us want to go beyond the sentence to study speech events. Arguments, disputes, conversations. And there's one particular speech event which has taken my imagination, which is the narrative, the storytelling. Because it has, as Aristotle said, a beginning, a middle, and an end. So it's something that is so well formed you can lay your hands on it. You know when someone's telling a story, you know when they're finished. When it comes to an argument, you don't know when it ever finishes, or when it began. So you want to look for something, aspect of human behavior, which is well formed enough that you can characterize it clearly and sharply. And the narrative is a very good example that's grown enormously since I first wrote this paper in '67. Narratology has become a huge field.
Yeah, related to that, do you ever, when studying language change, feel limited by data, by what variables are there to study? Do you ever feel that there would potentially be other variables that you don't have access to that would be a better explanation of language change?
It's absolutely so. There are some things that are changing that don't occur very frequently. And so you can't do quantitative studies of them because they don't occur more than once or twice. The variables we found most useful are the frequent ones. So I've characterized the linguistic variables I've studied as those that form closed sets, where you can say, it's not occurring here, it is occurring over here. A lot of linguistic changes in progress, you can't say when it didn't occur. So we've been most successful in these quantitative methods by being able to count 5 out of 1,000 times it occurred. So some linguistic changes escape our net. For example, in African American English, there's a growth of the be meaning habitually. I be doing this, he be running his mouth, they be talking too much. Trouble is, we can't say when it's not being used, even though it's fairly frequent. So in using quantitative methods, we take advantage of probability theory. And to do that, you want to be able to say, here's a set of human behavior which is clearly defined, and we can say when this occurs and when it doesn't occur. That's where formal linguistics is very useful. Because without a formal linguistics that set up a set of categories, you can't do that kind of counting.
Thanks, Professor. Could you say, what do you think about the position of language acquisition studies in the field you're talking about? I think, for instance, when you're talking about the narratives, they've been very important to put the slogan and burning and so on, also with language acquisition. But in general, how important is language acquisition? What happens there in relation to the question of language variation and change?
Well, I think our greatest linguist is clearly Noam Chomsky. And Chomsky said, whatever language is like, it has to be such that children can learn it. And he therefore created a whole field of acquisition of syntax. I think for everything we do, the acquisitional side is very important. And here's the biggest mystery. I got a paper that I've given recently called What is to be Learned? To show that children are programmed to avoid the idiosyncrasies of their parents. They don't grow up speaking like their parents if their parents come from another area. And this must be because the children are somehow have a way of detecting what is not general in their parents' speech. Every linguist has had this experience. But there's something more mysterious, which is that when children leave their parents' influence and join a larger group of their peer group, and a larger group of the peer group, which is the community that they can communicate with, they begin to follow the patterns of the largest, most general community they can get to. They go to school, they copy the kids in the 10th grade. Move to 11th grade, they copy the kids in the 12th grade. And somehow they wind up ahead of everybody. How that happens, we don't know. But most of the answers to the questions we have are in the field of acquisition. My colleague, Gillian Sangaborshi, has been studying language change across the lifespan, where it's certainly true that people do continue to change and they may follow the changes going on or go in a contrary direction. The general pattern seems to be that the action occurs before you're 16, 17 years old. And we have some studies in high school, but we haven't really studied the path from the time you leave your parents' influence to the time that you've lost the capacity to form new grammars. So that's an area that I would suggest is wide open for people to make progress in.
Just a little footnote, don't underestimate what adults can do or what older people can do. For instance, that the Queen of England, Elizabeth Windsor, apparently changed her pronunciation over 60 years of her reign. I think that's, we shouldn't underestimate what can happen after 16 years. Most interesting things perhaps happen during adolescence, but later on as adults we constantly adapt to the phonetic environment around us, and we do change, even at my advanced age.
Well, I bow to my colleague who was studied this in some detail, and to my great surprise, found cases where, well, let me go back to the case of Nicole. Nicole was not only correcting short A, but completely revising the phonology of it. She moved from a very complicated system whereby you had lexical distribution and grammatical distribution of short A to a very simple one, where the rule is if M or N follows the vowel, tense and raise it, otherwise it's lax. To do that, she has to raise certain elements that were lax before. She has to say bank, not bank. She has to say Miami, not Miami. She has to say I can, not I can. So to my great surprise, all kinds of people in elite college-educated are doing this. And they seem to be doing it later than I would have thought. So it was a great surprise to me because when I studied New York City, the adults would correct in the most irregular fashion. When they didn't want to speak like New York, you could never tell what they were going to say next. But this has surprised me. So how old the people are doing this? When did Nicole start doing it? I don't know. But it's a great field of research to find out, as people move from high school to college, what they can do in learning new dialects. I'm skeptical personally. I tend to feel that the critical period is quite definitive. But I didn't expect Nicole and company to recreate this very simple, clear dialect. So that was a surprise to me.
Yeah, I was wondering if you had a theory on why people tend to dislike linguistic changes. I mean, with letters to the editor and all that sort of thing.
You mean what people react to linguistic changes?
Yeah.
I do have a theory.
No, but why? Why you don't like change?
Oh, I think there is one thing that distinguishes language from all other forms of human behavior, and that is the golden age syndrome is absolute. In all our field work, there are many old people who said, oh, I love these new computers. I really have a great bang. I like the new fashions. No person has ever recorded an older person saying, I love the way young people talk. It's so much better than the way we talked when I was a kid. And that's universal. There's no other form of human behavior where it's so true. There's got to be a reason for it. Language change is always seen as a form of deterioration from some perfect earlier stage. And that goes along with the other fact which interests me, which is that linguists are always indignant at the crazy things people say about language. And when we study human behavior objectively, when we come to their opinions about language, we just get angry and indignant that they're being so foolish. I think we have to stop doing that and say, the apparently it's natural for people to have poor grasp of what's going on. And maybe language wouldn't work too well if people perceived it clearly. That's not a theory, it's just a hunch. I don't know how to proceed to do research on that topic. But I do think that everywhere we are objective, except when it comes to our friends' prescriptive ideas about language, where we get indignant. I'm not getting any disagreement on this point. But, yeah.
I have a question regarding how do you see this progress, modern progress in technology affecting linguistic change, such as computers and social communities such as Facebook and many others? And how does this interact and influence our progress of decaying the language?
Well, since I've been studying sound change, texting and chat rooms don't have as much an influence. Skype is another story, and it might lead to changes. I haven't myself plunged into this, but I think that there have been interesting studies of texting. One particular study had to do with Arabic, the conventions for texting with pharyngals. Some people use the number 6, some people use a different number, and there were social conventions. When I first read studies of internet behavior, I said, gee, that was so easy. And then I remembered another scientific maxim I have, which is always do the easiest thing, which is really the scientific procedure. If there's a way to gather your data quickly and easily, do it. So I would certainly, let me give another example. In one of my studies of narrative, I came across the fact that there were 2 events. I grabbed his arm, I twisted up behind him, you saw this. I had a theory that that's really a single action. Grab and twist. It's not as if first you grab and then you twist. It's a single action. So I got on Google and I said, let me look for a grabbed and twisted. And I got 270,000 tokens. So it's, I think that ingenious and intelligent research on the internet is called for. Now, one of the big questions is, what is the role of the mass media generally? And we're all puzzled by the fact that in English, the latest linguistic change of any significance is a new verb of quotation. He's like, which you may have heard from some of the Nicole. It's quite possible that the mass media played a role in the dissemination of this through the whole English-speaking world. Because Frank Zappa's biggest hit was Valley Girl in 1982. And 1982 seems to be a reasonable date for the rapid explosion of "We Like."
Could you sing it?
I don't know it that well, but I was listening to it just the other day, and there's plenty of these "Be Likes" in it. So the general problem about the view of the mass media is, if a certain artist who's well known uses a form, where do they get it from? And usually this change is well underway. But in terms of acceleration, it would be foolish to think that the uniformitarian principle applies. Let me talk about that in terms of literacy. Uniformitarian principle says that the forces that created the mountains and beaches and cliffs are the same as those that you can see operating around us today in geology. And linguistics has led us to say that literacy did not make a huge difference in the development of language. But it must have to some extent. To say the internet would have no effect would be pretty foolish. Yes.
Do you think language change happens consciously? I mean, for example, one of your
examples, you said that she was a leading role in the variation. Do you think that the people are aware of them being a leading role? Do you think that it just happens naturally, or do you think they are aware of it?
Well, I think we can say with absolute certainty that Celeste Albany was not aware of that particular variable. In general, I have a paper called The Mechanism of Linguistic Change, I produced in '65, which still seems to hold up. It says that language change starts as an indicator with some social correlates, but no one is aware of it. There's no style shifting. Then it graduates to what we call markers, where you get people style shifting, but still not being aware of it. And then what we call stereotypes is where people can talk about it. They can talk about Hakika Mahaved Yad or Toity Street in New York City. These stereotypes then lead to irregular correction when people become aware of it. But not every linguistic change follows that pattern. The two that I showed showing a straight line are totally invisible and inaudible to people. There's big changes that are happening in the Great Lakes area. This great rotation of 6 vowels we call the Northern City Shift has absolutely no social awareness. So the question is, do all changes gradually rise in social awareness at some point you become aware of it? I don't think so, but many do. And when they do people do become aware of it, they usually react against it the way we were talking about, and they correct it, as I used to think, in a very irregular way, which is responsible for a lot of lexical diffusion, but not necessarily. But this rise in social consciousness also relates to all of us, because we're not aware of what's happening around us. Listening to recording of spontaneous speech intently is an art, and to be able to hear something you weren't told about, a new linguistic form, a new syntactic construction, is very difficult. Very few people in their lifetime ever hear anything new. But once in a while, you say, ah, look, they're doing this. I never heard anybody do that before.
I'm sorry, we had to break it up. I want to thank